Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody. Oops, sorry, that was my chat box there. I trust you can all see the presentation there. And yes, great. So we want to thank everybody, first of all, for coming and joining this conversation. My name is Shayna. I am the climate coordinator for the city of Oakland. And I guess maybe before we dive in, we a very quick round robin of the presenters, just so you can see the faces you're about to see. So I'll go through quickly. We also have Michelle Plus from the city of Albany. You want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. I'm the community development analyst for the city of Albany.
And Eden Brookman from San Francisco.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Eden Brookman, Department of the Environment for San Francisco, Senior Green Building Coordinator there.
And Brian Reyes from Marin.
Hey everyone, Brian Reyes with Marin County, Sustainability Planner with a Community Development Agency.
Great, and Mia Kitahara from StopWaste.
Hi, this is Mia Kitahara, Program Manager with StopWaste.
Fantastic. So I'm going to quick introduction here. We have a jam-packed day, but I do just first want to thank you all for being part of this conversation. This is a really fascinating, scary, interesting, exciting time in the climate world, and I think in the building world too. So we will be talking about operational and embodied carbon in the built environment. And I think even if you haven't come across those terms, you've probably thought in some way or another. So if nothing else, maybe we'll come out of here with some shared language today, but I'm hoping that we will do a lot more than that. So we're going to start with a quick introduction, why we're here. We will cover a bit of climate action policies happening around the San Francisco Bay Area. What are different cities and counties looking at? How are we thinking about the built environment? How are we thinking about potential partnerships in this area? And then we're going to really dive into embodied carbon. We'll, yes, talk about kind of the definitions, and then really how we're thinking in local governments, at least, about what it is, how we can tackle it, how we can do better. And then we're going to go into break rooms, and we're going to talk about how we can move forward. And just a sneak peek, we this group of local government folks here with you today, we have fantasies about turning this into a little mini series. So we're definitely going to want to talk at the end or through our breakouts about whether that might be something that we're all interested in. We certainly are hoping that this is going to turn into a bit of a partnership, an ongoing conversation, and then we'll move on there. So starting with urgency and the opportunity of this moment. And I do not know why that picture is pixelated. That was not intentional there, but we'll just go with it. So we think of the building sector as really a key opportunity for local governments and for the architecture and design community to work together in partnership in tackling the climate crisis. And I want to say that when I talk about the climate, those of you in Oakland will know that we really think of the climate crisis and the equity crisis or social justice issues writ large as very, very intertwined. So we really are thinking about whole of the community, whole of the economy, solutions and approaches when we talk about this. So I want to make that very clear from the outset. Oakland is very much not alone in that thinking. The latest report came out just a few weeks ago from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, painted a truly dire picture that the Secretary General of the United Nations called Code Red for Humanity. That report said in no uncertain terms that yes, climate change is absolutely human caused. There's no denying that, as if there ever was. And you may remember that back when we had the big climate talks in Paris in 2015, people were talking about we need to really stop the temperature increase at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, this report said that no matter what we do at this point, we're going to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius. At this point is, can we hold it there? Can we prevent it from going beyond that? And the good news in the report, at the risk of saying something that I've probably heard many times already in the last few weeks, is yes, we can hold it there. We have plenty of tools. The technologies are here now. We're not waiting for technologies that are so certain are going to come. They're here right now. The financial, political, and policy means are available to us now. We just have to muster the political will to get there. And I personally can. Just last year, the California Legislative Analyst's Office said that between 8 and 10 billion with a B dollars of existing California property is likely to be underwater by 2050. And an additional 6 to 10 billion is at risk during high tides. That's the California Legislative Analyst's Office. They are looking shrewdly at the financial bottom line of things. So we need to treat this as the crisis that it is. But the opportunity is that there are so many new approaches in the building sector, and that there are a ton of leadership happening, especially here in the Bay Area. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Mia, who's going to talk about some of the approaches, the different approaches around the Bay.
Shayna, so yeah, in the face of this crisis, our state is a global leader in trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is good news. And within California, the Bay Area, as you might expect, is leading, and specifically the cities and counties here that are setting really ambitious GHG reduction targets. The exact targets vary a little, but generally we're looking at zeroing out emissions by mid-century. And I'll note that the IPCC report Shayna just talked about is telling us to move this timeline up to 2030. But the point is, we're going for zero. Sometimes it's expressed as carbon neutrality, and other times it's 80% reduction, which is essentially going for zero and having some residual leftover emissions. And in the short term, we're aiming to get about halfway there by the end of this decade. Again, the science is urging us to do this more quickly, so we'll see if that gets updated. The map you see here shows all of the Bay Area jurisdictions that have some form of climate commitment or climate action plan. And below are just some of those covers. And my colleagues later will talk about what it looks like for the built environment, but just to know that built environment is one of the very key sectors that the cities are looking at. So next slide, Shayna. So focusing on Alameda County, this just shows the range of reduction targets between 2020 and 2050. And I haven't listed the jurisdictions, but just to show that whereas we were going for incremental reductions until 2020, post 2020, so now we are aiming down to zero. That means kind of a shift in how we're doing this, from shaving off emissions through some efficiency measures to eliminating them, decarbonizing our systems. So I encourage you to look up, the climate action plans in the places where you live and work. Alameda County, we're proud to say and thank that we were the first county that isn't also a city like San Francisco, where every jurisdiction adopted its own climate action plan. And now they're updating them for this post-2020 deep reduction goal. And in addition, they're recognizing and adding the complexity needed to really tackle climate challenges, including resilience and adaptation to climate impacts, what we're already seeing and anticipating worsening. Some of that is going to affect the built environment, and how climate intersects with social equity issues like Shayna was talking about, and taking a more complete view of our community's role in global emissions by taking a life cycle lens to emissions. So Shane, I'm going to pass it back to you to share how Oakland is doing that life cycle view.
Thanks, Mia. In Oakland, we conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory every 2 years. And that's a practice that's pretty common among cities that address climate in any way. But what most cities in the past had done are called local or core emissions inventories. And the way I think of that is, if you drive a car from point A to point B within your jurisdiction, what comes out of the tailpipe, that's what's counted. Those are your local or core emissions. But of course, the car that you're driving was made somewhere. The gas that's burning in the car, creating those emissions, that was oil under the ground that was drilled, that was transported to where you filled up, all of those emissions from those activities, the mining, the manufacturing, the extraction, the transportation to your city boundaries, none of that is counted in that traditional style of local or core inventory. But of course, those are the emissions that are the most easy to measure. So when Mia is talking about the numerical reduction targets, usually those are structured around local emissions. But Oakland has also conducted what's called consumption or life cycle, we refer to it as life cycle emissions inventories, which is taking into account that full upstream global picture of all of the emissions, all of the activities that went into allowing us to do the activities that we're doing. And that is what I think of as the true picture of what we're responsible globally, as Mia was saying. Generally, you can see the figures there from Oakland's 2017 reporting year inventory. And what it works out to is, in general, when you go from the local to the life cycle approach, it's about 3 times more. Profile of where those emissions are coming from changes dramatically. So you can see that in the local approach, transportation is by far the source of emissions. Now, the building sector is the second biggest. When you go to a life cycle approach, the building sector now becomes the third biggest, but of course it's much, much bigger in absolute emissions than it was in the local. But you see there in the material and waste, the role that the stuff we buy, the stuff we purchase, that we consider so important in our daily lives, becomes the line of what we're looking at. It's the stuff we consume. It's our purchasing habits, how we buy it, when we throw it away, or do we do something throwing it away. That becomes so important. And I will say that that wedge there actually does include a lot of building materials. Oakland, that's where a lot of our building materials and construction activities show up, is in that orange sector. And so this is kind of the premise for looking at embodied versus operational carbon. So from here, I'm going to hand it over to, I think, Michelle. Is that right? Or Eden. I'm very sorry, I don't know where we're going. But, or no, is this me? Okay, I'm sorry, you all. This is actually my slide too. Okay, so this is just another little bit to kind of show you the, excuse me, the comparison from local to life cycle emissions. Yeah, I'm so sorry about that gap. This is directly from our emissions inventory. So the life cycle emissions there, the light blue, that's the lion's share of each of those pieces as we get more energy efficient. And of course, as we reduce the use of fossil fuels in buildings, that dark blue piece is going to go away, and we're going to need to tackle what is embodied, what is embedded in the actual materials that we're using. The action there in the orange, that's one of the 40 actions in our climate action plan. I'm not going to read it. But the idea here is just to really be thinking about the materials, the stuff that goes into everything that we do and everything that we, of course, design and build. So now I am going to hand it over to Eden.
Thanks. Before we jump into the details, so let's briefly cover what is embodied carbon. So the official definition is that embodied carbon is the sum impact of all the greenhouse gas emissions attributed to materials throughout their life cycle. Okay, but what does that mean, right? So we're going to break this down into several stages, and Shana, we're about to have some rapid fire returns. Next slide. The product stage includes all the energy inputs required for raw material extraction, transport to the factory, and the manufacture of products. Next. The construction process stage includes the energy inputs required to get the materials to the project site and to construct the building. So this also means that off-road equipment and diesel generators used on construction sites are part of the calculations. Next. Together, the impacts from these two stages are known as upfront carbon. Some folks use this phrase interchangeably with embodied carbon, but as you can see here, it only tells a portion of the story. Next. Here comes the use stage. And though energy used to directly power operations is excluded from considerations for embodied carbon, There are several other activities that are included, like maintenance, repair, or replacement over the expected life of the building. You could see the operational impacts in the red below the line, whereas the embodied carbon considerations are in green above the line there. Next. After that comes the end of life stage, which includes the embodied carbon impacts from conventional processes to demolish a building and then take materials to landfill. Next. However, we are also tracking preferred options for the next life of materials. That's called beyond the building life cycle. And this is reuse, recovery, and recycling. So that's all the stages of embodied carbon. It really has a lot of things for us to consider, and therefore a lot of places for intervention as well. Next slide. It's useful to provide some context for the significance of embodied carbon by briefly touching on its counterpart, operational carbon. Though there's still quite a lot of work to be done here, we've started to move the needle on operational carbon here in the Bay Area and throughout California and beyond. Michelle's going to talk more about this in a moment. But according to the UN Environment and the US Energy Information Administration, embodied carbon will be responsible for almost half of total new construction emissions between now and 2050. Unlike operational carbon emissions, which can be reduced over time with bundling energy efficiency, with building energy efficiency renovations and the use of renewable energy on site, embodied carbon emissions are part of the process of building itself. So the deficit gets locked in place once construction is complete. Next slide. The time value of carbon is another important consideration. So if we look at the distribution of total carbon emissions for a typical code compliant building in the United States across a 60-year lifespan, the operational carbon outpaces embodied carbon 3-to-1. Next. But we need to significantly curb carbon emissions in the next 10 years to limit global warming. As both Shayna and Mia already mentioned, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has reported a dire need for drastic action to be taken by 2030, and many recommend at least a 65% decrease in that time period. So let's look at that slice of the pie chart. Next, thanks. Now the impact is flipped 2-to-1. Embodied carbon over operational carbon. And in the Bay Area, we're already outperforming baseline code compliance buildings for operational carbon. We've already eliminated it from new construction in many cases. So from an emissions perspective, the impact for new construction is embodied carbon. You could see what San Francisco is doing for embodied carbon in our climate action plan. The update will be published hopefully in the next couple months. I also hope that many of you took part in our public process to review that document. You can see where we're at right now at sfenvironment.org/climate plan. Now I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Eden. So we know that our main focus today, of course, is embodied carbon, but we just wanted to give you a quick update on what we're doing for operational carbon, especially to try to make sure we minimize those emissions that we saw at the end of her graph a few slides ago. As many of you know, electrification is really the focus for reducing embodied carbon or operational carbon, because we can take advantage of the incredibly clean electricity we have here in the Bay. Berkeley really led the way with a ban on gas hookups in new construction in 2019. And since then, most of the cities in the Bay Area have followed with some version of a REACH code that either requires electric construction for all buildings or most buildings, or in some cases just incentivizes it. There are a lot of minor variations from city to city, but they're all really getting at the same goal of making sure that all new buildings are electric. And at this point, that's really becoming the norm. Also, statewide, our 2022 energy code is going to require heat pumps or heat pump water heaters for all new buildings as well. Next slide. Now, existing buildings is a little bit more complicated, and the process for electrifying these is really just beginning now. Berkeley is currently working on a plan for electrifying existing buildings. It's very much focused on equity. We know that's something that's going to be very important and also very difficult in that process. Piedmont has also already put in place a REACH code for existing buildings. Basically requires certain projects to include 1 or 2 electrification or efficiency measures from a menu of options. And we also have a lot of other organizations that are working on this. Marin in particular has a rebate program for electric appliances that's been very impactful. But really, in order to make this happen for the huge number of existing buildings we have in the area, we're going to need help from the state with large-scale policies. We're going to need public buy-in, and we're also going to need all groups to be really engaged in the process, including architects. So with that, I'll hand it over to Brian to get back on track and tell you a little bit more about embodied carbon.
Thanks, Michelle. So Brian Reyes here with Marin County, and we're one of the first jurisdictions in the country to require a universal carbon limit on concrete within our county borders, of course. So as you all know, it's well known that one of the most carbon intense materials flowing through our economy and through buildings are concrete, or more specifically cement. So our code specifically focuses on that material and will mostly impact upfront carbon, as Eden described earlier. So our building code requires would-be project applicants or design team and contractors to prove they have either one, reduced the amount of cement in their concrete design mix, hence reducing the amount of embodied carbon within their material, or number two, reducing the global warming potential or carbon in the concrete mix design via EPDs or environmental product declarations. So both pathways to compliance have effectively reduced embodied carbon by honing in on this carbon intense cement. So since going into effect in November 2019, one important lesson we've learned when implementing this building code is that the design community, the architects or structural engineers, as well as the contractor community, are either one, not familiar with the idea of embodied carbon, two, how to appropriately specify the concrete, and three, how to actually comply. In terms of compliance, we also as government want to recognize that we're not the most proficient on making these things easy to comply. For the design and development community, we fully recognize this as a pain point, hence why this conversation today, it's important for us to work together to address not only the technical challenges, but also the collaborative way that we speak to each other and to make this as painless as possible. So as government actors, we are here to accelerate these conversations and as well as learn from you. Next slide, please. So many of you may already know some of the trends across the state that is in concrete, but in materials in general. So at the state level, we have something coming down the pipeline, State Bill 596. It's making its way through the state assembly right now. And that's crafting legislation to set a net zero 2045 emission reduction target for all cement used in California. At a local level, similar to Marin County, Bay Area cities such as Oakland and Albany are looking to adopt building concrete requirements by 2023, and San Francisco as well. At an operations level, government entities have used procurement to address embodied carbon in their concrete. For example, the State General Services Agency passed a Buy Clean California Act, which also requires departments such as Caltrans to comply and procure low carbon materials such as concrete, steel, flat glass, and wool-board insulation. Over the past several years, locally here, regionally, County of Alameda has been using their influence over concrete procurement on their capital projects, and that is made as part of their RFP requirement and bid packages. Statewide, but also maybe a trade association wide, California Nevada Cement Association has set a carbon neutrality target of 2045. The Structural Engineer Institute has SE 2050 carbon neutral target. Of course, Architecture 2030 challenge, where you all are centering climate action around reuse, reduction, and sequestering carbon. So in summary, a lot is going on. Next slide, please. Going back to the policy, when crafting our embodied carbon and materials policy or procurement standards, this quadrant graphic frames how government actors will typically develop policy compliance options. So the top half there illustrates policy compliant options that are specific to certain building materials reducing mainly that upfront carbon, whereas the bottom half, you see there, takes a more comprehensive approach to reducing upfront as well as operational carbon. Starting in the upper left-hand corner, policies such as Marin County have a prescriptive or cement limit approach, influenced mainly by the concrete design mix. To the right illustrates a more performance approach, which is a bit harder to comply with, where the supplier of that concrete must disclose to the design team the embodied carbon within this specific material, usually through environmental product declarations. For Marin County, we both have a prescriptive and performance approach as part of our requirements. If we look to the bottom left-hand corner, the policy may prescribe efficiency and reuse requirements as part of all materials going into a whole building, not just focusing on a specific material. To the right of that, compliance is attained through performance by providing a whole building life cycle approach. So whereas Marin County's concrete law focuses on a specific material impacting mainly that upfront carbon, there's a more systematic and holistic way to reduce embodied carbon in buildings across all life cycle phases that Eden described. Next slide, please. So this more holistic approach to reducing carbon is really looking at the whole building, not how Marin County is doing it. We're using, oh, previous slide, please. Yep. We're not looking just at a specific material. It's not a matter of choosing whether to reduce a carbon through a single materials code or selecting a suite of materials to regulate, or appropriately sorting and recycling materials discarded thereafter the construction and development. Rather, it is a matter of balancing the need for addressing single actions while looking at interventions we could take across the entire building system. So no government entity has fully enforced a whole building emission reductions into building code yet, but cities like San Francisco and Oakland have articulated that in their climate action plan, indicating pathways to establish targets, but even more than that, developing building codes aimed at reducing carbon across the whole building life cycle. So whether through upfront operation or end of life carbon, a building project would need to comprehensively reduce its carbon footprint. So typical strategies include, but are not limited to, consumption of fossil fuels to power operations and construction, but also the procurement of low carbon, biogenic, or carbon absorbing structural materials beyond concrete. Then that includes such as mass timber, sequestering aggregate materials, the integration of adaptive reuse and designing for deconstruction into common practice, salvaging, reusing, and recycling of building materials, as well as we as the government have a supportive role in designing effective policy and encouraging the growth of regional building material reuse markets. Next, we'll have Shayna talk about our upcoming breakout groups.
Shayna, you're muted.
Sorry about that. There's a lot going on my screen here. Me and I are gonna kind of tag team this one, but we are about to move into breakouts at this point, but we are doing really well on time. I am seeing a lot of questions in the chat, and Mia's gonna talk in a moment about how some of those we're gonna carry into the breakout rooms. But I just want to see if there are any burning, clarifying questions about anything that you've heard in the last half hour. You can, I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself, but you could use the raise hand function. Okay.
Mentioned that a lot of the questions in the chat are pertain to the topic areas that we'll be doing in the breakout rooms. So we could also bring remaining questions or things that come up in the breakout rooms as burning questions back to the group afterwards.
Great. Okay. So just to kind of bring us back to basics and zoom out a little bit from what we've been hearing, we talked a lot about, how we were coming into today and perspective that I think the government reps here before you kind of that we share. And one of the things that we share is real humbleness about the fact that the requirements that our various cities have, we know that they're different. We know that these requirements are changing sometimes rapid time. We know that sometimes they are really complex, Byzantine, the requirements are different, or the same requirements are there, but with different goals or stated differently. There are different paths to compliance. We know that this is not necessarily the easiest thing for the communities like you who are tasked with compliance. And yeah, we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge that that can be a hardship. But like I was saying at the beginning, it's also, I truly believe, an opportunity for innovation. I have talked with a lot of builders and architects and others who are pretty excited about this time, because it's a time where we can really experiment and see how far. One of the answers here is certainly advocacy at the California Energy Commission, the Building Standards Commission, at the federal level, to go farther, to go faster, to be more unified at higher levels in responding to the climate crisis. But the fact of the matter is that those levels of government be such diverse and disparate geographic areas and community areas that they actually do rely on this very patchwork approach that we have here in the Bay Area to show them what's possible and to drive the market. Building electrification is a really good example here, where you have these cities, particularly in more progressive communities, that are passing building electrification requirements. And that really is the way that we prime the market. So that is really the way that we prime the market to start electrifying, decarbonizing all the existing buildings that are in our community. And that's the way that we stimulate demand, so that it's more affordable, so that other communities that don't necessarily see themselves as at the forefront of innovation, policy-wise or technology-wise, how they can come along as well. At the same time, local governments ourselves are walking a line between ambition and risk aversity. In Oakland, yes, we have a progressive community. The Bay Area, yes, is the hotbed of innovation, but our communities, at the same time as telling us we need to lead on climate, are saying that we also need to lead with equity and make sure that we're not going to harm any sectors of our community, right? For restaurants, this stuff can be hard. For affordable housing, this can be a little bit, it can be a little bit destabilizing, right? So that's a major driver of our work. And that brings me to why we're here with the design community, because we need you to help us lead. We need you to show us what's possible in terms of materials, in terms of process, in terms of supply chains, in the same way that local governments are telling the state and federal governments what's possible in terms of legislation.
All right, thank you for coming back. That was a little earlier than I thought we were going to come back. In our group, it was a rich conversation that was just getting started. So there's definitely interest to continue it, either, hopefully through AIA Bay as partners, but also individuals that want to follow up. And pass it to other folks in the other groups, maybe. Well, I guess we could go deeper into reporting out what the specifics were, but Shana, how would you like to run this?
I want to apologize to everybody first for losing internet. I only was able to join at the very end. So I think if we could just go around and the folks, one person from each group, maybe from Eden, Mia, Brian, Michelle, maybe share out just one thing that really caught your attention. One or two things that was exciting to you, that might be nice, and then we'll just wrap up. And if I could get host privileges, I could share again. Thank you so much. So maybe I'll pass it to Mia because you were talking.
Sure, yeah. So the group can chime in too, but I think there's this feeling of it's the bio-based material space is where I was. And there's this feeling that it's been done before. It's technologically possible. It's kind of the human structures and institutions that are getting in the way, and the assumption that buildings need to be done cheap and fast. And a certain way recent generations have been doing it, but the tide seems to be turning. And if we can get younger, professionals coming in to see it differently from the beginning, we could turn buildings, which are always going to be constructed, buildings into the sixth carbon sink, to quote David Arkin here. So a lot more to explore on the specifics of how to do that, how to remove code barriers, and how to create financial kind of viability for some of these newer products. And I'll pass it to Brian. You're unmuted and you've got specs.
Can you hear me okay?
I hear an echo.
Sorry, doing both mics. So I want to apologize from our specs team. I thought we had more time than that. So, but we did populate a lot. We didn't get to discuss a lot. So a lot of this will just be interpretation based on what I'm seeing from our sticky notes. So first on specs, where could we incorporate embodied carbon into our specifications? And I asked also the question, where do you feel like it's more important as well? Some things that came about were about first, putting those buildings, aligning a lot of the specifications in existing building codes that we see in operational, sort of green building codes statewide. Some pain points that we notice are a lot of green building codes certainly focus on operational carbon. So making sure that we focus on embodied carbon and a lot organizational part of policy, developing targets and goals, integrating those into design documents and then bid documents as well. And certainly having clear procurement and purchasing policies and standards. The second question, what would enable us to go further with specs? Some things we'll look at, it seems like we want to look at our, what would be helpful to architects are sample specifications. For the Marin for the Marin code, we do have sample specs, as well as what are some other common carbon reduction intervention strategies, such as design for disassembly. Also increase understanding and availability of the actual products available on the market, whether that's education through associations like this, discussions and bringing in the ready mix and supplier industry, and understanding what those cost implications are. And not only the cost, but also the strength and the workability, and also the sustainability, the global warming potential of the materials that we're bringing in. So I think that's kind of a nutshell of what I'm seeing here on the second question. Yeah.
Do we want to pass it to Eden?
Oh, sure. So we had a small but mighty group and talking about reuse and end of life, and unsurprisingly, themes of deconstruction and modular prefab, avoiding composites, thinking about screwed instead of glued connections, and how does that relate back to seismic considerations or seismic requirements. And then as well as, really thinking about life cycle assessment to quantify the value of new versus salvage, to really start to bring in to kind of the center of attention, that benefit of eliminating kind of the upstream carbon from design processes. And then as far as what will enable to go further with reuse, one thing that I really, that kind of sparked my interest was this idea of offering pro bono architectural services to help small businesses in need and make it easier to integrate reuse into projects. I thought that was really exciting, and it came from an architect. So it sounds like that might be a possibility. And otherwise, other incentives for the construction industry or contractors to work with reuse, tracking, and infrastructure. So that's a little summary about what we discussed.
Right, and Michelle.
Yeah, so we were in the life cycle analysis group, and we also didn't have, we started to get going with a great conversation and ran out of time. So there's lots to talk about. And I'll just say that everyone who wasn't in our group will have access to, you have access to all of the slides of the Jamboard. So if you have thoughts on any of these other, I would just change views. If you have thoughts on any of the other groups, you can go in and add your thoughts there as well. But our group, we brought up some ideas about, streamlining the process and creating guidelines, what that might look like. Also, the question of life cycle really kind of made people think broadly about how the analysis is interacted with at different parts of the life cycle, such as the creation, the manufacturing process, contractors in the actual building, and how those all might interact with life cycle analysis. So those were just a few thoughts that we got into, and I'm sure we'll have lots more to talk about coming up.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for sharing out the themes from those breakouts. So if any, I realize that we've lost a few people. I know that a lot of people had to hop at 1, and so we were hoping to, we allow it a little extra time, but we wanted to keep it as close to an hour as possible. But we wanted to kind of just have a quick kind of check the pulse of folks who are here in the room. We don't have a poll set up or anything at this point, but maybe if folks could just show us with a show of hands or by writing in the chat, if you would be beneficial here. It sounds like there were incredible suggestions and ideas and just a lot of ongoing thoughts and questions, because this is such an emerging area. Do folks think it would be beneficial to have some follow-up sessions? And I'll just put out there maybe just an hour-long conversation on each of the 4 topics to dive a little bit more deeply, maybe broaden the conversation, get more people into each of those conversations that you have breakout rooms. Sarah is saying yes in the chat. Nick says yes. John says yes. I love this. Great. Well, smaller break rooms focusing on specific topics. Okay, so I think that we will work with Mike and with Ali and Sydney. I know Alice is really wonderful on this topic, and some others who've been here. So yeah, I think we'll kind of reconnoiter and come up with a schedule that would work well for everyone. In the meantime, our contact info is up here in front of you. I know that Sydney has been recording, so that should be available. And I think I can hand it over. Alice, wonderful, I love the enthusiasm. Maybe hand it back to Mike or Sydney or Ali if there's any final thoughts that you all have.
Ali? Thanks again for being here. Thanks for the time from all cities around the Bay Area. One of the things that we need to probably discuss in further sessions is how can architects help the government, the local municipalities to do better for the environment. So that's a big question. So it's a two-way dialogue, and we get and we give and we receive. So if we are going to continue, I would like to also see Ben and Alice as co-chairs of Committee on the Environment, how they think we can keep the dialogue an ongoing process and benefits at the end of the day our clients who are the residents of the planet and make it a better place. So again, it's a two-way conversation, two-way collaboration, and yeah, and how can we scale up exactly? But thank you again for your time. That was wonderful. That was a very good start. It shouldn't be ending here, and let's continue.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and I guess we'll be in touch. Oh, Mike, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, this sounds like we've got a series that we need to tee up, and a little bit more time in each of these breakout rooms would have been great. So the demand is there. I'll work with you guys to get something on the calendar, and we'll start solving this problem here in the Bay Area and set up a method by which others might follow. All right, well, thanks everybody, and off we go to our next Zoom event.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.